Hello? Anybody hear me now? Anybody hear me now? Hello? Great. All right, well, it's 2 o'clock, so might as well get started. Thanks, guys, for coming. As I mentioned, what we're going to be doing is... All right, well, it's 2 o'clock, so might as well get started. Going over the first couple weeks of material, as I mentioned, up to and including Bootstrap. Sorry, I'm kind of unused to this. I'm hearing myself echo like 5 times. All right, I'm just going to push forward and try to ignore my own voice, which is awful. All right, let's start from the very, very beginning. Okay, I apologize if this is going to seem a little repetitive or redundant for some of you, but I think it's important that we start from the very, very basics. Okay, so on that note, I'm starting with our template. Obviously, if at any point my audio cuts out, the video cuts out, or anything like that, please do let me know. I am keeping an eye on the live chat box next to the video. If you have any questions, post them there, and every now and again I will stop and review and go over any questions that have been asked. Given the nature of the live stream, it's going to be difficult to really make this into a real Q&A session, but if you do have any burning questions, feel free to leave them. All right, let's go. So, the very first thing that a lot of students run into trouble with at the very beginning is setting up the template correctly. And the template is crucial because it is how we set up all of our projects moving forward. So just to review exactly what the template is, it is a project folder. Here I've made a copy of my template and it's all ready to go. It's a perfect imitation of what your template should look like in weeks 1 through 4, minus possibly font awesome. But what the template is an empty project folder. Here in this illustration up here, it's simply called My Project. And inside of that folder is 3 items: an index.html file, a CSS folder, and an images folder. Okay, so if I open up template copy, 3 things inside: index.html, images, CSS folder. Then we go one level deeper. Inside our CSS folder is our main.css file. Our main.css file. And as you should know, this is where we write all of our CSS, or our styles. We'll talk about what that is and what that means in a minute. Inside of your images folder, you probably have nothing. I threw a couple images in here so we can use a couple during the exercises, but yours might be empty. You will fill up your images folder as you build your projects with images that are relevant to the project you're building. So if you're working on the superhero website, you're probably going to have pictures of superheroes in here. So once again, we have the root project folder. And inside of that root project folder is index.html, the CSS folder, and the images folder. Inside of the CSS folder is your main.css file. Inside of your images folder is an image. Here's just an example, my image.png. It's purely an example. And if anyone is still in any way confused by how the template folder should be set up, imagine this whole thing is our root project folder. And again, inside all we have is index.html, a file where we write our HTML, a CSS folder, and an images folder. As you go one level deeper, inside the CSS folder, you will find main.css. And inside the images folder, you will find any images that you have for your project. Okay. So that is our template in a nutshell. What we always do when starting a new project is always to copy our template, repaste it onto our desktop, and use that as our project folder. So I'm going to do that right now. I'm going to right click on my template. I'm going to select copy. I'm going to just paste it right here. And I'm going to rename this to demo because this is all one big demonstration. I'm going to drag this folder into my text editor. I dragged it on top of my shortcut to Sublime and it popped right open. If you don't have a shortcut to Sublime, it's very simple to make one and add it to your desktop. If for whatever reason this isn't working, I can also just open up Sublime. Let me close this. I can open up Sublime, go to File, Open Folder, and then I will find Demo on my desktop. Click Select Folder, and it opens up that folder all ready to go. We have the new project ready to go and set up in our text editor. To get myself set up to start coding, I'm going to double click on index.html, so that's all ready to go. I'm going to open my CSS folder by clicking on this little arrow next to it, and that will open or collapse my CSS folder so I can see exactly what's inside these subfolders. And I'm going to double click on main.css, which is empty. My CSS file currently has no code. Alright, so let's talk very briefly about what HTML and CSS are. HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language. Hypertext Markup Language. That's HTML. And HTML is the fundamental code that we use to write anything that you see on a website. HTML, we like to refer to it as the skeleton of a website. We use that to build elements, which we then actually see on a website when we open our page in browser. HTML is where we write all of the foundational fundamental code that constructs a website. CSS, on the other hand, CSS stands for Cascading Stylesheet. CSS is what we use to style our websites. So we build it, we build the bones of it with HTML, and then we add the skin and make it look the way we want it to look with CSS. HTML constructs the skeleton or the scaffolding of our website. It's where we create elements and add elements that we're going to see on our website when we load it. CSS is where we style them, make them look the way we want. We give them color. We change our fonts. We do anything beyond actually constructing an element in CSS. Now, when you're making your template, the first thing that we always tell you to do is link your CSS file to your HTML. So if you've just started, the way you might set up your HTML file is like this. You have an empty file, you save it as index.html, and when you open it in your text editor, you type HTML and hit tab. You get this little boilerplate batch of code, which is super useful. But as is, this is incomplete because my main.css file is not connected to my HTML file in any way. In order to do that, I'm going to create a link tag. April, you said an echo's coming through? Is it a really bad echo, or is it just kind of distracting? Is it a really bad echo, or is Hello? It just kind of distracting? Alright, well, I'm going to keep pushing forward. Okay, it's distracting. Let me see if I can figure out where that's coming from then. How about now? Is that any better? Is that any better? Okay. Sorry about that, guys. Had an extra audio source on there. Okay. So I'm going to keep moving. The way we connect my main.css file to my index.html file is with a link tag. And it's going to look like this. Link, rel, or relationship, equals Stylesheet, href, which stands for hyperlink reference, equals. And here's where I see a lot of students get held up. Your href needs to be the file path that leads to your main.css file. So in my case, I'm going from my index.html into my CSS file, where I'm going to look for my main.css file. Let me rephrase. I'm going from my index.html file into my CSS folder, where I'm going to look for my main.css file. File to folder to file. So my file path is going to be css/main.css. What this is telling the browser is, from where we currently are, which is this whole index.html file, look for the CSS folder, and this / means go into that folder and look for main.css. Okay? Now, it's extremely important to understand how to navigate file paths. Let me reopen this in a new window. If our CSS file is located anywhere else than in our CSS folder, we still need to know how to find it. How to find it using a file path. And this is especially important as you guys get deeper into the course and you start using other code, or when it comes time to build your portfolios and you download themes, or you use a Bootstrap theme. You might find that the CSS file for that theme is not in the usual place, and you may need to know exactly how to find that file with a file path. So for example, if my main.css was right here, right next to my index.html, then my file path would just be main.css. If we had a folder called assets, and inside that assets folder we had a folder called styles, and inside that styles folder was our main.css. Okay, so now our main.css is inside the assets folder, inside the styles folder, and there it is. Well, now our file path is going to be assets / styles / main.css. This is not the configuration for your template that we recommend at Codify, but in the real world, you will encounter different file trees for projects or templates or themes. So you need to be able to understand and navigate file paths. That said, I've now reverted straight back to the way we recommend, which is main.css inside of our CSS folder. Okay, now moving forward, we've got our link tag, which links my main.css to index.html, and just to make sure everything is hooked up, I'm going to create an h1. It says hello world, save. Let's open that in browser. Okay, my hello world is showing up. Everything looks good. I'm going to go into my CSS file, select my h1. I'm going to make it red. And let's see if that changes when I refresh. It does. So my CSS is hooked up, it's working, everything looks good, we're happy. Alright, so let's dive straight into the week 1 material. This is the in-class quiz for week 1. I'm going to write my answers here in my code. If at any point anything that I'm writing is too small, if you'd like me to make something bigger, you'd like me to go back and address something that I kind of glossed over, feel free to let me know, okay? So, number 1, how do you write the HTML for an H1 inside of a div? Well, first I write my div, and I'm going to close it right away. Good habit to get into is always close your elements right away when you create them. The easiest thing in the world is to forget to close an element, especially when you're nesting them several layers deep. And then inside of that div, I'm going to put an H1. Close it, and if I want, I can put some text in here. Okay. If I refresh my page, nothing should change, but now my H1 is actually inside of a div. If an element has a class of box, how would you write the CSS for making its background color red? Well, let's go ahead and give this div a class of box. Class equals box. For those of you who don't know or are not familiar, I'm writing in Sublime right now. If you're writing in Atom, your colors might be a bit different, but you should still see the same patterns, which is to say, all of your elements should be one color, body, div, H1, and all of your attributes should be a different color. And these are attributes: class, rel, href, id. Those are called HTML attributes. It's not something that we talk about a lot in class, but it is an important term to know, especially as you get deeper in and you start exploring more advanced attributes. It's just something to keep in the back of your head. This class, it's an attribute. This rel, relationship, it's an attribute. And href is an attribute. It's just a good thing to know and keep in mind. So I've given this div a class of box. I've given it a class attribute which equals box in quotations. Now I can select that class in CSS with .box, and let's give it a background color of red. And just so my H1 doesn't blend in, I'm going to get rid of that color red on the H1. Now when I reload, I see my div has a background color of red and the text inside it is black. Okay? Moving on. How do you connect your CSS and HTML? We just went over that. That's with this link tag, which has a relationship attribute equal to Stylesheet and an href attribute equal to a relative file path. This relative file path is probably the most challenging thing students have to face in the first week or two. And it's often the first source of problems. If you see that your styles are not applying, that your main.css does not, yes Nick, I can zoom in, that your main.css does not seem to be hooked up, the problem is usually, 90% of the time, this link tag. Let me know if the code is still difficult to read. Okay. How would you write the HTML for a div with a class of container? So I'm going to add another div here, and it's going to look exactly like my div with a class of box, except this div has a class attribute equal to container. Where do you write your CSS? We always write our CSS inside of our main.css file. I'll talk more about that in just a second. All right, discussion questions. What should you always name your first HTML file and why? You should always name your first HTML file index.html for a very simple reason. Index.html is what the browser looks for when it tries to open your web page. If you name your HTML file home.html, it is not going to work. the only file that a browser recognizes by default is index.html. That's what it looks for as the root file for your web page. If it is called anything else, the browser will not know what to do and your web page will not load. That is why we name our first file, our first HTML file, index.html. We can create, and you will often see, other HTML files with different names. You will probably run into about.html, contact.html. My own website has illustration.html and development.html. But the main home, very first root page of my website, as with any other, needs to be contained inside an index.html file. It's the only one that the browser knows to open automatically. What is the best way to add CSS to your page? Well, there are actually 3 ways to add CSS to your page that I'm going to mention just briefly. One, I'll show you very quickly, is called an internal style sheet. And that's when we do something like this. We open up a style tag somewhere in our HTML, and inside there, we just write regular old vanilla HTML. Let's go for white. Okay, so it works. This H1 selector here and the color property and the white value inside, this is a perfectly valid CSS that you would see in any kind of style sheet. But this is written inside of a style tag in our HTML file. It's called an internal style sheet, and it is something that we recommend you do not do, ever, if you can help it. That's number 1. Number 2 is inline styling. Inline styling is actually something like this. You select an element, and you give it a style attribute, which just contains regular old CSS inside of it. Still works. My H1 is still white. This is inline styling, and you will sometimes see this with a whole lot of properties in here. And this can go on essentially forever. You can add as many CSS properties in here as you want. However, we also suggest that you never ever write your styles inline like that. Okay, so that's number 2. Inline styles and an internal style sheet. What we recommend, what is best practice and what is always safest, is write your styles in an external style sheet. That's what our main.css file is for. External style sheet linked to our index.html. Okay? How would you correct this tag? Let me copy this over. Let's pretend it's inside container. Well, we immediately see that there's a problem because it screws up all our color coding, doesn't it? So what that tells me right away is I should look for the counterpart to this quotation mark. If I add that, our colors come back and everything looks good, but there's still a problem. The problem is an image tag is actually written with img, not image. Also, images don't use href attributes for their relative file paths. They use a source attribute. Okay, that's a corrected image tag. Now, if I wanted to be really picky, I'd say that, my images folder is actually called images, and I don't actually have a smiley .png file. I have a huts.png file. So there. Now we have a corrected image tag. If I reload, there we go. Okay. I'm going to get rid of that because that's hideous. Okay, moving on. What is the difference between a div and a span element? April, you say you're getting video playback interrupted. Is anybody else? All right, try reloading the page, April, if you can still hear me. And if not, try copying the URL link up at the top and opening it up in a new window. If it's still not working for you, it might be an issue with your connection. Okay. What is the difference between a div and a span element? Well, in this context, what we're looking for is a div element is a container of other elements. It contains whole elements. It is an element itself, but it can only contain whole elements. On the other hand, a span can actually contain parts of an element. To demonstrate real fast what that would look like, I can wrap half of this H1, just this world, in a span. And if I do that, I can then isolate that word by selecting my spans and making it green. Now world is green. Let's make it white. Let's give it a larger font size. Okay, so that's a span. If I really wanted to, I could just isolate as much as or as little as a single letter. Okay, so sometimes that can actually lead to a very fun effect, especially if it's the first letter of a line or a paragraph. Span. Spans are very useful when you're dealing with a lot of text. If you're dealing with a quote and you need the name of the individual who said that quote to be italicized, that's something you might use a span for. You might. There are other ways to do it, of course. Or just like this, if you wanted to isolate the first letter of a word or of a paragraph and make it larger, a different color, anything like that, that's what a span is very useful for. A span can contain a piece of an element, whereas a div can contain only a whole element. Another difference between a div and a span is a div is inherently a block element. And you should remember, the one characteristic you should definitely remember about a block element is it's greedy. It takes up all of the horizontal space that it can. To demonstrate, let me just put some text inside of this div here with the class of container. Reload. See, my text is all the way over here, but if I open up my inspector, expand my body, and I hover over this div with the class of container, you see that blue box that spans the full width of my page? It's doing that because my div is a block element. It contains, it expands to 100% of the width of its own container, which is the body. Divs will always do this by default. By contrast, a span is actually an inline element, which means it only takes up as much width as it requires, as its content requires. So that's another very important difference between divs and spans, or more importantly, block elements and inline elements. Block elements are greedy. Okay. What CSS properties could you use to change the size of an element? Well, let's take .box, and I'm going to make it taller and give it a height of 400 pixels. That was too much. 200 pixels. There we go. It's much taller. I've changed the size. I can also give it a width property. Let's go 250 pixels. Okay. The value that I give to these properties can also be percentages. If I want it to be 50% of the width of my page, 50%. And this is more useful because it's actually responsive. It's always going to be 50% of my page. Okay. What is the difference between margin and padding? What is the difference between margin and padding? Let's go back to dot box. Get rid of the span. I can give dot box a margin of 50 pixels. Let's see what that does. It pushes it 50 pixels from the top and 50 pixels from the bottom. Let me comment this out, and we'll see the difference one more time. I'm going to get rid of all the other margin, though, on these other elements that we're seeing. No margin and no padding to confuse us. Okay, good. So they're flush against the top and the left side of our page. But if I turn that margin back on dot box, then the div with the class of box is now pushed 50 pixels from the top of the page and 50 pixels from the left. By contrast, if I give it a padding of 30 pixels, it actually pushes my hello world inside by 30 pixels. Okay, let me get rid of this height, because I think that might be confusing us right now. Okay, so now we have 30 pixels. If I turn that off one more time, this is no padding. This is 30 pixels of padding. Now we have 30 pixels of padding pushing inwards from all sides. So 30 pixels between our content and the bottom, 30 pixels between our content and the top, 30 pixels between our content and the left side, and there would be 30 pixels between our content and the right side if it extended all the way. Our text is actually a block element, so it is taking up all this space, but it's hard to see with the text aligned to the right like this. Let me go ahead and turn off margin, so now we only have padding. Okay, this is with only padding. If I select my element, let me put margin back on, refresh one more time, save and refresh one more time. If I actually select my element, then I can see the box model down here. I can see if I hover over margin, we've got 50 pixels of margin at least on all sides of the element. Border, there's no border, so there's nothing there. Padding, there's 30 pixels of padding pushing in from all sides of our element. And then this blue is the content inside of our element. Content, padding, no border, and margin. Just to complete the image of the box model, let's give it a 5 pixel border. Okay. So now we've got content, padding, border, margin. Okay. Content, padding, border, margin. So padding pushes to the inside of an element, margin pushes to the outside of an element. It's an important distinction to remember. How do you open the Google Developer Tools? Name one benefit they provide. Well, to open the Google Developer Tools, you right-click and you select Inspect. I use my inspector constantly. You should all be using your inspectors constantly. If ever something is happening on your page that you don't expect, something doesn't look right, something isn't working correctly, always open your inspector and you can examine your elements. When you open your inspector, I'll make it a little bigger, you'll automatically see an Elements tab and a Styles tab. Your inspector might not be at the bottom, you might have it on the side like this, but we still have Elements, Styles, Elements, Styles. Or it might be on the other side, it might be in a whole new window. I like keeping mine at the bottom. It's entirely a matter of personal preference. In my Elements tab here on the left, I can actually select any of the HTML elements on my page. I can open up my body, expand it like this, and I see the div with the class of box, and the div with the class of container. I can expand each of these and see what's inside them. Or I can click on this little button here, this little arrow on arrow inside of a box like this, and when it turns blue, I can actually hover over and select elements that way. So this is div with the class of box. This is the h1 inside of div with the class of box. This is the p element inside of div with the class of container. This is my HTML element, etc., etc. If I select an element through either method, let's select div with the class of box, then in my styles tab I can see all the styles that I have applied to .box. It matches exactly what we see here. .box, background color, width, height, padding, border. .box, background color, width, margin, padding, border. And you can even see that height is crossed out because I have it commented out. Well, if I want to turn it back on, all I need to do is hit that checkbox. And I can see the changes. I can see what everything does. Now, while we're on the subject of margin and padding, here I wrote margin 50 pixels. The property of margin and the value of 50 pixels. The way the browser is actually reading that, you see this little arrow next to the 50 pixels under margin? If I click on that little arrow, I can actually see how the browser is interpreting that. Margin top, 50 pixels. Margin right, 50 pixels. Margin bottom and margin left, 50 pixels. Okay? I'm not going to go much further into this just yet, but it is important to understand that the property margin is actually a shorthand for 4 properties. 4 properties. So what I could actually do is change this margin 50 pixels to margin 50 pixels and 25 pixels. That's 2 values. And now I can see how the browser interprets that. Margin top, 50 pixels. Margin right, 25. Margin bottom, 50. Margin left, 25. Okay, so that's a very useful bit of shorthand. I can take advantage of the fact that margin is a shorthand for these 4 separate properties. And if you really wanted to give a different margin to every side, you could do that. There's 4 values, and this is how the browser chooses to interpret it. Most often, you'll see margin followed by 1 value or by 2 for top and bottom and left and right. This is extremely useful. The same goes for padding. Padding behaves in exactly the same way. Okay. Why do we keep HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and images in separate folders? It's really simple. We do it for organization purposes. It's easier to keep your code organized. It's easier to maintain your code. And it's much clearer for other developers who need to look at your code. What's the difference between back-end and front-end? I'm not actually going to get into that. I don't think that's necessary to address in this video. What's the difference between an ID and a class? Well, in a nutshell, an ID is more specific. An ID is more specific than a class. An ID is most often used for only one element in your HTML. For example, this paragraph might have an ID of dummy text. And now no other element in my HTML should have the ID of dummy text. It's only going to refer to this specific paragraph element or P element. By contrast, any number of elements can contain the class of box or any other class. If I wanted this to be the class of purple elephant, it could be. And I could have 14 elements, 40 elements, all with that same class name. Now, your classes should make sense to you and should make sense to other developers who need to look at your code. But the point is, classes are not as specific an identifier as an ID. An ID is pretty much as specific as it gets. Okay? I would like to take a moment to talk about CSS Specificity and CSS overwriting. We'll see a little bit more of it as we push into the later weeks material, but the way CSS works and why it is called Cascading Stylesheet is because the more CSS you write, the CSS that is further down your page has more power over the code written above it. So for example, let me select my H1 again, and I'm going to give it a color of blue. I'm going to reload. We should see this hello world turn blue, and indeed it does. And down here, I'm going to select my H1s again and change the color to green. Well, now it's green. If I select my H1 with my inspector, I actually see both colors here. They're both here. They're both present. They've both been registered and interpreted by the browser, but color blue is crossed out. It has been overridden by color green. Now if I turn color green off, I can see color blue comes back. But the way the code is written, color green is going to override color blue because it is further down. Now let me give this H1 a class. I'll give it a class of intro. If I, instead of selecting my H1 up here, select the element with the class of intro, do we think my H1 is going to stay green, or is it going to turn back to blue? Well, what it does is it turns blue. The reason now why green is not overriding blue is because selecting an element by its class is more specific and therefore more powerful than selecting it by its element. .intro is more specific than H1. An H1 selector like this is called an element or type selector, and it's really as general as it gets. An ID selector, on the other hand, what did I call this? Dummy text. An ID selector is actually as specific as it gets. So it's going to be very difficult to override this ID selector unless I use the ID selector a second time further down in my CSS, which is not something you should do. That makes for messy code. But this is something you might run into a lot. We have an H1 selector which sets all H1s in my HTML to be green colored, but then we have a specific H1 or a couple of specific H1s which we want to be blue. So we select them by their class identifier and change the color. And because classes are more specific than a general element selector, this color overrides this color no matter where they are situated in the code. This is another reason why you will frequently see CSS organized in certain ways, such that all the general element selectors are at the top, and then you'll see a lot of class selectors or complex selectors in the middle, and then towards the bottom you'll see all these specific ID selectors. And it's a good practice for organizing your CSS that way. Most of your text editors will actually color coordinate your selectors such that it's very easy for you to do. In my case, all my general element selectors are red, and all my class and ID selectors are this green color. Okay. CSS specificity is really, really important for planning and outlining your pages. And we will get more into it as we move forward, but always bear it in mind. And if you see a style not applying the way that it should, what you need to do is open your inspector, select that element, and see if the style you expect to see is being overridden. If it is being overridden, like here I see my color green is being overridden, what I want to look for is another color property that is somehow being applied. So you would scroll through any styles that this element has applied to it and look for another color property that is not crossed out. In this case, it's very simple. It's right up here. But this tells me that the .intro selector is overriding my H1 selector. So this tells me where to look to find the problem. It even tells me the line in my CSS file. I can go to line 5 in my main.css and find that selector. Line 5. That's not right, because I reordered everything. Let's try that again. There we go, line 17 in my CSS file. There it is, .intro. Okay, let's jump into the week 1 exercises. They should go pretty fast. I will be moving a little quickly through the exercises, so if you have any questions or if you need me to slow down on something in particular, feel free to ask. I'd like to get through all 4 weeks, so gonna move at a nice clip. In HTML, create a UL element with a class of nav. Create a UL, close it right away, class equals nav. Add 3 CSS properties to the UL. I'm going to jump over to main.css, select my UL, or I can select it by its class name, .nav, and I'm going to give it 3 CSS properties. Background color, let's go red. Margin, I'm going to give it no margin, 0. And padding, let's do 15 pixels. Okay, so we shouldn't see much on my page now. We just see this red bar. What's next? Create 3 LI elements inside the UL and add 3 CSS properties to the LI. Background color, display, and padding. So I'm going to create 3 LI elements. I'm going to just put link 1, 2, and 3 in here. And now they need to have a background color. I'm going to select my LIs. Background color. Let's go with white. Margin. No, display and padding. Display, I'm going to leave that blank for just a second. Padding, 10 pixels. Now, very common thing that happens in week 1 is students have no idea what display is or what value to feed it. Once more, this is a property. It's expecting a value. You can't leave it blank like this. It's not going to do anything. So property, background color, value, white. Property, display, value, something. Property, padding, value, 10 pixels. This is the way CSS works. We have a selector, and then we then manipulate that selector with properties and values, or property and value pairs. Okay? So if I didn't know what I could possibly feed to the display property, I could go to W3 Schools, display. And it's the first thing that pops up, CSS display property. Here's one inline. And here I've got a whole bunch that I could look at. I'm going to make this display inline block because that's the #1 thing you should remember for making list items line up horizontally. So if I refresh, this is what we've got. I'm going to turn this off and show you what they look like without that display property. Okay, they look like a bulleted vertical list of block elements. They take up all the width. Remember, this white background color is currently on our LIs. Just to demonstrate that further, I'm going to give them each a margin of 5 pixels, so they'll separate. Okay, this white background color is coming from our LIs. That means our LIs are taking up the full width of their parent UL element. That's because they're block elements. Okay, and if I turn inline block back on, they will line up horizontally. If I change this to just inline, display inline, they still line up horizontally, and that's good, that's what we want. But what inline block does is it allows them to behave like inline elements, like this, but also to receive block element styles, things like margin and padding. Well, margin in this case. Okay, so it's very important, and it's why we use inline block so much. Inline block allows us the greatest amount of control. It allows inline elements to receive block element stylings, but display inline block is the #1 go-to method for lining up elements horizontally when they don't want to be on the same line with each other because they're block elements. Create an anchor element to connect each LI to one of your favorite websites. I'm going to have each one go to Google, but the way we do that is inside of your LI. I'm going to create an anchor. And what we need is an href. And what we need inside that href is the URL to which we want this link to go. Okay, so we have our text that we want the user to click on inside of our A tag, our anchor tag, which is inside of our LI tag. And you'll frequently see this out in the wild like this, all on one line. And this can be very visually confusing. Okay, so if it is confusing, feel free to break it up. Just do this. And it makes it much easier to visually decipher. Okay. I also encourage you not to confuse links that utilize an A tag with link tags. And here we've only seen one link tag, which connects our CSS file to our index.html. You will never use link tags in your body like this. Okay? Whenever we say a link, we're referring to an anchor. We want to create a link to Google, a link to your portfolio, a link to the About page, a link to the Contact section. That's all referring to an anchor tag. Anchors are the HTML element we use to create clickable links. So I'm going to save, reload, and now if I click on any one of these, it'll take me to google.com. Perfect. Create 2 div elements below the navigation, each with a class of box. So I'm going to create 2 divs with a class attribute equal to box. 1 and 2. Add 2 CSS properties to the divs, float to the left, and width of 50%. God damn it. Alright, I'm going to select my elements with a class of box. I'm going to give them float left and width of 50%. Now, let's reload and see what we see. We see nothing. The reason for that is, currently, our divs have no content. They have nothing inside of them. They have no color, and they have no height. So those elements are actually there, but they're, for all intents and purposes, invisible. If I hover over them in my inspector, I don't know if you can see, but there's a little div.box there with the numbers 356.57 times 0. What that means is they have 0 height. 356.5 pixels of width and 0 height. So those elements exist, but they're for all intents and purposes invisible. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to give them a height of 100 pixels. Reload. Now I can actually see my elements when I hover over them. I can see where they are, but they're still invisible because they have no color and they have no text, they have no content for us to see. So I'm going to give them a background color as well. Okay. Now, you may have heard me snigger a little bit before, and that's because I absolutely hate the use of float. I hate it. I hate it, and I tell all my students to never ever use it. So I'm going to go ahead and turn float left off and reload. Let's see what that does. Now the elements are stacking. We've got box up here and box down here. They're one on top of another, and let me give these a margin bottom of 10 pixels just to separate them. Box and box, okay? Two divs. Now, they have a width of 50%, which means they're only 50% of the width of their container, the body, but they still don't want to sit next to each other because they are block elements and therefore greedy. So, while float left or float right can be helpful in situations like this, it does a lot of nefarious, unseen things to your layout, and that is why I tell students never to use it. So if you really wanted these two divs to sit next to each other, you would treat them the same way that we treated our list items. I'm going to make them display inline block. And now they're still just a little too wide. Let's change this to 49%. There we go. I, to this day, do not know why an absolute width of 50% will not allow them to sit next to each other, but you can make this 49.99999. Still won't happen. So if you go for less than 50%, they will sit next to each other. And if you want them to fill up the full space, you're going to have to do a couple of CSS cheats that we're not going to get into right now. But display inline block allowed two block elements with a predefined width to sit next to each other on the same line. This is how we use display inline block. We use it to create horizontal nav bars. We use it to position elements next to each other on the same line when they don't want to sit next to each other. We use it a lot in Orange Juice. And I say never, ever, ever use float. That's just me. Okay. Inside one of the divs, create 6 header elements, each with one of the favorite things you learned this week. Okay, let's do it. H1, HTML, H6, CSS, H3, selectors, H2, hrefs, H4, link tags, and H5, file paths. The only reason I'm doing a weird order 1, 6, 3, 2, 4, 5 is to demonstrate that these heading numbers in no way refer to any kind of order to which you need to stick. It's not an order you need to follow at all. Let me take away the height attribute on dot box here. There we go. Okay. H1 simply refers to the one biggest heading. H6 refers to the smallest heading tag. And you can see here CSS is as small as it gets among these 6 headings. HTML is the biggest one. It's the only reason I wrote them out of order deliberately. You can write them in order, reverse order, doesn't matter. There's no relationship between H5 and H4, or H5 and H6, etc., etc. Now notice I took away the height property of dot box. Let me just comment it out. And now dot box will stretch to the needs of its content. It will stretch to the needs of its content. So this is with that height property. The text is forced to overflow. If I turn that height off, the box will stretch to whatever its content requires. However, its counterpart has disappeared because it now has 0 height again. All right, what's next? Inside the other div, create an image element with something you love as the picture. So I'm going to create an image element. Source equals, what images do I have in here? Crap. Onion. Okay, images / onion.jpg. I like onions. Alt equals, this is a picture of an onion. This alt attribute is primarily for visually impaired users, users who rely on screen readers, and it is very important for website accessibility, but it's not something you particularly need to worry about just now. Now, an image element is one of the few that doesn't have a closing element. There's no /img after an image element. If you do that, the browser will be confused. It is self-closing. Sometimes you will see developers write it this way. They both work. I'm going to save, reload, and our layout is completely messed up because the image is huge. So let's just fix that really fast. I'm going to select my image, give it a max width 100%. Don't worry too much about this right now. All it does is it forces the image to be no wider than 100% of its container, which is exactly what it's doing. Okay. Add 3 properties of the box model to the image. So I'm going to select my image. I'll give it a padding of 20 pixels. No margin. No margin. And I'll give it a border of 2 pixels solid white. White was a poor choice. Red. No. Green. There we go. Okay. So now because of that padding, the image is actually overflowing again, but that's okay. Let's just change this max width to 80% so it's all contained. And there we go. We have 20 pixels of padding on all sides of the images, and we can see that green border, which is actually where the image element itself ends. If I want to give it a margin of 5 pixels, we should see it push away from the edges of that purple div by 5 pixels. That's exactly what we see. Make it a little more so it's even clearer. Okay, there we go. That's the box model at work. Below the image, add a paragraph with some content. Add a second class to one of your divs. Select the P element inside that div and add 3 properties. I'm going to only do number 14. Not going to mess with a paragraph tag right now. But number 14 says add a second class to one of your divs. Something I see students do a lot is they'll write class equals box, class equals image container. This is not giving your element 2 classes. In order to give your element a second class, you simply go into that class attribute and hit space and write your second class name. Okay? This div has 2 classes, a class of box and a class of image container. It does not have the class of box image container. That is not a thing. If you wanted to give it the class of box image container, you would need to do box hyphen image container, box underscore image container. You could not do box space image container. A space inside the class attribute value indicates a different class name. So if I wanted to give it a third one, background purple, this div now has 3 classes. All right? And an element can have as many classes as you want. Those classes can be used to select that div, or each one of these classes might have its own property. So these might be the properties for .box, but any element with the class of image container actually has a different background color. Tomato. and any element with the class of background purple. I realize now this was a very poor choice. Let's go background color tomato and change this to border 5 pixels solid purple. Huh. I didn't save. Always save. There we go. Okay, so now let me quickly change this so it makes a little more sense. Div with the class of box. Being a div with the class of box, it should have a purple background. But because it also has a class of background tomato, it instead has a tomato colored background. And having the class of image container, it also has a 5 pixel purple border. So these are 3 classes at work. And you might do it this way because you might also have a div that only has the class of box and background tomato, but is not an image container. Or maybe you have one that is a box and an image container, but does not have the class of background tomato. Or maybe it's not a box at all, it's just an image container and has a background tomato. This is a way of planning out your styles and creating class names that have a certain style baked into them. Like BG tomato clearly means background color tomato. Now, rather than have to select any element that I want to have this background color of tomato, I don't need to do that. I can just give it a class of BG tomato. If that's feeling a little above you right now, do not worry. It's not strictly necessary to understand. I'm just trying to get it in the back of your mind that that is another approach to class names, which can be very useful for organizing your styles and the layout of your site. All right, so let's jump into week 2. While we're jumping into week 2, I just want to reiterate exactly how we're using our CSS selectors. Okay, we always have a selector followed by curly braces, and inside those curly braces we have a property, colon, value, period. That is the fundamental thing that you need to understand about how CSS is written. Selector, which selects the elements in your HTML, and what you assign to that selector is a property and a value. Okay, so first you're selecting the element, then you're manipulating it. Selecting, manipulating. Selecting, manipulating. It's important because that is a relationship we'll discuss much further when we get into JavaScript. Okay, so I'm resetting my template. Week 2. What CSS property can you use to center text? Well, if we wanted to center, let me write an H1. If we wanted to center this text, the text itself is already a block element, okay? It has 100% the width of its page. I can give it the property of text align and the value of center. And it is centered. Notice it is centered inside the width of its own content. If that does not make sense, it will in a little bit. Write out the HTML for a UL with 5 LI elements inside of it. UL, I'm going to close it immediately. LI, I'm just going to copy paste. UL with 5 LIs inside of it. It is important that you maintain your indentations. You need to indent, especially when you start nesting elements several layers deep. If you do not indent, You will regret it, and anyone who has to look at your code will curse you out. Write out the HTML for an A tag that goes to Google. The text should read, "Click me." An A tag, let me just create it and close it right away. And inside that opening A tag is where we define the link to which we want this to go, the URL to which we want this to redirect when a user clicks on it. https://www.google.com. But where does the text go which we want a user to click on? We want the text to read "Click me." That needs to go in between your opening anchor tag and your closing anchor tag. "Click me," right here. Without that text, we can't see anything, and actually there's nothing to click on. Okay, that text is what a user needs to click on in order to get redirected to this href. You can put an image inside of an anchor tag so that an image itself acts as a clickable link, etc., etc. If you created a new CSS file named about.css in your CSS folder, how would you link it to your HTML? Well, up here in our head, we would write a new link tag, relationship equals Stylesheet, href equals CSS, because it's in our CSS folder, / about.css. As simple as that, okay? Remember, if it were in the assets folder and inside the styles folder and inside the custom folder, this is what the file path might look like. But this is all relative to our index.html. We'll get into that a little bit more very soon. All right, what's the difference between Git and GitHub? Not going to talk about it. What are the 4 values we can change the CSS position property to? This is an excellent one. So here, I'm going to keep my H1. Let's reload the page, see what we're dealing with. I've got it centered H1. I can select that H1 in my CSS and give it a position of static, and that's not going to do anything. Position static is the default. Okay, every element starts as position static. As a quick note, if ever I wrote position initial, it would also read as position static. Initial is kind of like a reset button for any CSS property. Okay, so if I had one H1 somewhere with a class of intro that I wanted to not be text align center, then I might do text align initial. And that's going to find the H1 with the class of intro, and it's going to reset the text align property for that H1 to its initial value, which is actually left. Anyway, the point is, static is the default initial CSS value for position, static. There's also position fixed. And to demonstrate what that does, let me select my body and make it really, really tall. Position fixed. Well, it's no longer centered. We see that. But also, as I scroll, unfortunately, you can't see a whole lot of scrolling because the whole page is white. But if you see the scroll bar on the right, it is in fact scrolling. And what's happening is this hello world is staying with us. For a quick real-world example of that, let's go to grubhub.com. As I scroll down this page, see this red nav bar up top? It stays with me as I scroll. That's position fixed. It is position fixed. Now, why is it no longer centered? Well, that's because when its position is changed to position fixed, it no longer becomes a block-like element that takes up the entire width of the page. It now behaves more like an inline element. Its width is only as much as its content requires, unless I dictate otherwise and do something like width 100%. Well, then it's centered. Okay. But if I did width 50%, it's still centered within its own content. You see that? The hello world is still centered within as much space as the H1 takes up, but it's no longer centered in the middle of the page. That's not how text-align works. Okay, anyway, that's position fixed. It scrolls with us. It scrolls with us. Another thing to know about position fixed is other elements will ignore it as though it's not there. Let's create another H1. It says goodbye. Actually, I'm going to make this an H2. Make this an H2. It says goodbye. Not going to style it at all. My H1 is still position fixed. Let me take the margin away from my H1 so we can really appreciate how much it's being ignored by the H2. See, they overlap. It's because the H2 is essentially pretending that H1 is not there. Although, because it's position fixed, it will scroll with us and stay with our window. That's fixed. Now, let's take a look at relative. Position relative. Okay. With just position relative, our element has actually not moved or changed in any way. Position relative is interesting. If you just give an element position relative, it's not going to move, it's not going to change, it's not going to go anywhere. What position relative does is allow you to then move that element as precisely as you'd like relative to its existing position. So to quickly demonstrate what that means, if I did bottom minus 100 pixels, it moves that H1 down 100 pixels. Let's do minus 50. Now it's actually lined up with goodbye. It has moved hello world down 50 pixels, but notice that the goodbye is still acting as though the hello world is sitting right above it. If I comment out both of these properties, the goodbye doesn't move. The goodbye doesn't move because position relative actually maintains the initial starting position of the element. No matter where I move this, no matter where I move this hello world, the goodbye is still going to think that it's sitting right up here at the top, no matter what. Now, this is in contrast to the final position property, position value, which is absolute. If I set position absolute on an element, then just like position fixed, it turns into essentially a ghost element. Oh, hey, thanks, Dylan. It turns essentially into a ghost element. It will overlap other elements will pretend it's not there, pretend it doesn't exist. It is homeless. It no longer has a place to go. It no longer has a place where it belongs. It's ignored. Now, position absolute, an element will not scroll with your window. So let's just make my body really tall again. Real fast. See? Hello world stays all the way at the top. It does not scroll with us. That's the difference between absolute and fixed. But they both cause an element to become invisible to all other elements. Now, the other thing to know about position absolute is I can move or position this element as precisely as I'd like, just as precisely as with position relative. The difference is how the browser is going to interpret things like bottom minus 50 pixels and left 150 pixels. For the purposes of this demo, I'm going to change these to positive, and let's see where that positions our absolute element. Well, what that has done is positioned our element 50 pixels from the bottom of our window. If I close my inspector, we can see it's all the way down here. 50 pixels from the bottom of our window and 150 pixels from the left side of our window. It stays 150 pixels from the left, 50 pixels from the bottom. To demonstrate that further, let's make the body really tall again and reload. Actually, it did not do what I thought it was going to do. It's still sitting 50 pixels from the bottom of our window. Okay, we could set this bottom to top and this left to right. And it's now 150 pixels from the right side of the window, 50 pixels from the top. So these values, these properties and values, top, right, left, bottom, when used in conjunction with position relative, they all are relative dimensions relative to the initial starting position of the element. Okay, so if I change this to relative, this will move the element 50 pixels down, 150 pixels to the left from this center position where it started. Okay, and the goodbye will still believe that it's sitting up here. If I change it to absolute, then this will move it to 50 pixels from the top of our window and 150 pixels from the right side of our window, and the goodbye will think it's not even there. Okay. Last thing I want to say on the subject is you can use relative and one second. Let me do just p relative. I'm creating a div with an ID of position of p relative. I cannot type and talk at the same time. I'm sorry, people. Creating a div with an ID of p relative, and I'm putting an h1 inside of it now. The h1 is still position absolute. I'm going to get rid of these. I'm going to make sure that p relative is position relative. Okay? Pretty simple so far. I'm going to get rid of this goodbye. It's not relevant anymore. We've got a div that is positioned relative and h1 that is positioned absolute. No top, left, or bottom, or right properties have been added. So nothing has changed. Everything looks okay. Let me give this div a background color. Okay, that's another thing to point out. Because the content of this div is actually positioned absolute, it's as though the div has no content. So I'm going to give it a height real fast, 200 pixels. This is also supposed to be a hashtag. There we go. All right, we've got a relatively positioned div and an absolutely positioned h1 inside of it. Now, if you position an absolute element inside of a relatively positioned element, that actually changes how you can position the element absolutely. So if I do bottom 0, what we should expect is this hello world should be all the way at the bottom of our window. Actually, let me turn off this position relative and we'll actually see that. There we go, it's all the way at the bottom. If I turn position relative back onto its parent element, its containing element, so we have a relative parent and an absolute child with bottom 0, well then now Bottom 0 means the bottom of its parent element. Okay? Bottom 0, right 0, and let's make the width of its parent only 50%. This is right 0 and bottom 0 for this absolutely positioned element. This is super useful for precisely positioning elements on your website, or when you need some really complicated layout. This is a really neat trick of an absolutely positioned element inside of a relatively positioned element. The relative parent, I haven't moved it at all. I'm not repositioning it at all. All I did was give it position relative. So it hasn't changed. The other elements on the page will still recognize it and know where it is. It won't be invisible. It's a very useful trick for positioning absolute elements inside of relative ones. And I don't have to do 0. I could do, what could I do? Minus 100%. What does that do? All the way over there. Minus 10%. Overlap. Minus 50. Here we go. If I wanted it right there, it just gives me more precise control, potentially, over positioning complicated elements in a complicated layout. Good trick to know. This is not a comprehensive lesson on it, but I would encourage all of you to experiment with it if you're into that. All right. What are 2 ways to center elements using CSS? Let me take out all this CSS. Take out this ID. One way to center elements is, as we've already discussed, I can select my H1, give it a actually no, I'm going to select my div and give it a property of text align center. Okay, and that centers my H1 inside the div. Centers my H1 inside the div. If I give my div a width of 50%, it still centers the H1 inside the div. Let's bring that background color back. Okay, that H1 is still centered inside the div. That's what text align center does. It centers the content of an element. What it doesn't do is center the element itself. If we want to do that, we have to use another property called margin with the value of 0 and auto. Okay, so margin 0 auto centers the element itself on the page. Text align center centers the content of the element. Does that make sense? It's an important thing to know, an important distinction to realize. Something I will say real fast is margin 0 auto is only going to work on elements that have a defined width. Which is to say, if I comment out this width property, then the div, which is a block element, is already 100% of the width of your page. So it has nowhere to go. It has nowhere to center. It's already centered by default. So you have to give it a predefined width, and then it will center with margin 0 auto. Okay? What are 4 useful new HTML5 elements? I'm going to skip it. How would you write the CSS for changing the font size to 25 pixels and the font to bold? Let's do that. H1, font size, 25 pixels, font weight, bold. Something that I want to point out real fast. You guys, I see a lot of students doing this. They'll write font, and then they'll look for the property that they're looking for here on this list. They'll look for whatever they think they want. This is really nice, and it's useful for when you're learning, but don't rely on it. Don't use it as a crutch. If you need to look for font family, if you're not sure that's the property you're looking for, then you can look in this list, see, oh, it's font family, but don't just hit enter and move on. Okay, what you want to do is see, oh, it's font family, now let me type it. You're not going to become a better typist, you're not going to become a better coder, and you're not going to be able to internalize all of this stuff more by using those shortcuts as a crutch. Later, when you already know all this, when you're just working for efficiency's sake, that's when you can really take advantage of shortcuts like that. But as students, please do not lean on that feature of your text editors. Okay, a lot of you are not necessarily the strongest typers, and that's completely okay. But part of this class should involve working towards becoming more confident and stronger typers and coders. And actually typing these properties goes a long way to helping you learn them and internalize them and being familiar with them. Okay, what is the CSS for adding an image to an element? I'm going to give my div a height for this one. What is the CSS for adding an image to an element? Now, it says CSS, so we should know that this does not involve creating an image element in HTML and adding an image that way. The way to do this is with a property called, I'll leave that, with a property called background image, and the value we feed it is URL. And inside of these parentheses, another file path, images / let's go with huts again. Okay. This is the file path that we would write if this image was inside an image tag in our HTML. To demonstrate what I'm talking about, if we wanted to add this image down here, source equals images / huts.jpg, alt equals huts. Okay, this is how we would write it as an image tag in our HTML. But, and this is important, we're adding this file path in our CSS file. So think about where we have to navigate to find this image. The way I like to demonstrate this particular thing is, imagine it as a house. Okay, imagine that my image.png is the image file that we're looking for. Okay, and we're writing inside of main.css. This whole house with no bathroom is our project, our root project folder. And inside of this house, this root project folder, we have two bedrooms. We have the CSS bedroom, and we have the images bedroom. And we also have index.html, which is for some reason a couch. Now, to get to my image.png from index.html, we need to go from the couch into the images bedroom. And how many doors do we open? We open one. So the file path for that would be images, go into the images bedroom, open one door, and look for our image. And that works. That works perfectly fine. But now we're not coming from the couch. We're coming from the other bedroom. From main.css, we need to go out to the living room, and then we need to go into the other bedroom and look for our image. And how many doors do we open? We open 1 and 2. So what we're missing here is how do we go from the CSS folder, the CSS bedroom, out to the living room before we do all of this? And the answer is with ... / This ... means go up a directory, go up a folder, go outside of the folder we're currently in and start from there. So we go up a folder, open a door, that puts us in the living room. We go to the images room, open a door, and we look for our file. Okay, this dot dot forward slash tells us to go up a directory. Now, if our images were in a deeper folder, if they were in assets, and if they were inside the images folder, which was inside of assets, then this would be dot dot, which would put us in the assets folder, dot dot, which would put us in the root folder. Actually, wait, I'm getting confused. No, it would be dot dot, which puts us in the root folder, then assets forward slash images. Okay. If our CSS file was inside a styles folder, inside of an assets folder, then we would need to go dot dot, which puts us inside the assets folder, dot dot again, which puts us inside the root project folder in the living room. Then we go into images, and then we look for our image. Okay, so this is why file paths are extremely important to understand. If they're not clear to you, feel free to reach out. It's an easy thing to practice, but it is an essential thing to know. And it is easy to practice. To someone who's familiar with it, it's easy, but it's also the easiest thing in the world to mess up, to get confused about, to not be clear on. It's also really easy to psych yourself out if you're not familiar with using a computer or typing in general. File paths are not a particularly intuitive form of English, so it's completely understandable if they give you trouble. For the purposes of the Codify projects, the way we tell you to set up your folders, I do like to use this analogy of the house. If it's helpful, use it. If not, then if it's more helpful to think about this in a linear fashion, then that's totally fine. You go from main.css outside of the CSS folder to this whole main project folder here. I should really be using a stylus for this. And from here, you go inside of images, and then you find your image. So you have to go up first when you're adding a background image to CSS. That's the point we're getting at. Okay? What does CSS stand for? We talked about that. Cascading Stylesheet. List out 3 different types of CSS selectors. Okay? Well, we've got the element or type selector, which is h1, h3, image, div, section, body. These are all element or type selectors. Then we have the class selectors, which is, dot intro, dot box, dot bg tomato. Okay? We use a dot followed by the name of the class. And we have ID selectors, hashtag CTA, hashtag random element, hashtag anything you want. In this case, we use a hashtag followed by the ID name that we have given to that element. So we've got an element or type selector, class selector, ID selector. It's important to know your selectors. If you're in any way confused about selectors, I've made plenty of practice in the form of CSS Selector quizzes, CSS Selector Interpreter, exercises. Feel free to reach out to me if you want additional practice with CSS selectors. But don't let them psych you out. Okay? Always try to decipher them if you can. If you see a CSS selector you're not familiar with, like you might see something like this, and it throws you for a loop, start from the very end and work backwards. Okay? So what does a button select? It selects all button elements. And it's selecting all button elements inside of div elements, which are inside of div elements. So what this would select is something like div, button. Okay, you might have 4 buttons that are inside of divs, but this is how you need to think about breaking down complex CSS selectors like that. If it were something like this, it's looking for buttons inside of elements with the class of box, inside of divs. All it takes is practice, but it can be confusing. Write out an unordered list with 3 list items inside of it. I'm not doing that. Let's jump to the exercises before I lose my voice. In HTML, create a nav element with the class of navigation. A nav element. So last time we created a UL with the class of nav. Now it's asking for a nav element with a class of navigation. Create one UL element inside the nav element, and inside the UL add 3 LI elements. UL, close it. LI, close it. 3 LI elements. Create one anchor element inside each LI element. I'm going to keep the href blank for now, and I'm just going to add link 1. 2, 3. Create a section element below your nav element. So I'm going to go below my nav, create a section element, close it. I really wish I knew where the home key was on this keyboard. There we go. Create a header element inside the section element. So here inside my section element, indented, I'm going to create a header element. Close it right away. Keep my code nice and clean. Create one H1 element inside the header element with the content, my favorite superheroes. Probably not going to use superheroes because I've got a bunch of images and I don't want to go trawling Google Images right now, but I think you all are smart enough to make the connections without it actually being about superheroes. Alright, create 3 div elements below the header, each with a class of box. Div class equals box, close. Copy, paste. 3 div elements, each with a class of box. Inside each div, add an image, H2, and P element in that order. So I'm going to open up one of my divs with the class of box and add an image. I'm just going to keep the source and the alt blank. And then it wants an H2, and then a P. Copy all this and paste it. So now we have 3 divs with the class of box, each of which contains one image, one H2, and one P. Add a picture of one of your favorite superheroes to each image element. Alright, so what do I have? I've got images / earth.jpg, alt is going to be Earth. I've got images / dragonbones.jpg. Alt is going to be dragon bones, and then images / octopus for final.gif. Octopus. Notice I'm actually putting a GIF. Notice I said GIF with a hard G. Anyway, I'm putting a GIF inside one of my images. That is actually something you can do. And it is no more complicated than simply using the correct file extension if the file you have is actually a GIF. Okay, now this is going to look awful because all my images are going to be enormous. Yeah, that's about right. But we're getting there. We're getting there, one step at a time. All right, where am I? Add the name of the corresponding hero inside each H2. Earth, dragon bones, octopus. Add a description of the corresponding hero inside each P element. I'm going to put some dummy text. Inside each of these P elements. And I bet it's still going to look absolutely horrid. Get rid of this. And yes, it does. Okay. Select the body element. So we're jumping to CSS now. Select the body element and set the margin to 0. Select the UL element, and set the padding to 0. Select the H1 element and set the font size to 2M. Add 4 CSS properties to the nav element. Now I can select my nav element like this using an element selector, but because I gave it a class, I'm going to go ahead and use it. .navigation. Or I could get even more specific and do nav.navigation. Okay, if you're not sure what the difference between .navigation and nav.navigation is, well, .navigation is looking for any type of element with the class of navigation. Nav.navigation is looking for the nav element with the class of navigation. Okay? That's the nav element with the class of navigation. Not the image with the class of navigation, not the div with the class of navigation, not the H1 with the class of navigation. Only the nav element. So nav.navigation is more specific than .navigation. 4 CSS properties, background color, tomato. I like tomato. Margin, I'm going to go 0 margin. Padding and text align. Padding, 25 pixels. Text align, let's go right. Be a trailblazer. Text align right. Okay. We're getting there. Add 4 CSS properties to the LI elements. So I'm going to do nav space LI. That's selecting all LIs inside of my nav element. I could also do .navigation space LI. Same things will be selected in this case. Background color, white. Color, I'll make the text tomato colored while the background color is white. Display, you remember the display property that causes elements to line up next to each other horizontally. And then margin 15 pixels, padding 10 pixels. Okay, getting there. Add 2 CSS properties to the A element, the anchor elements. So I'm going to select all my anchors. Going to give them color. Actually, this is a good thing to point out. Notice I tried to change the text color of my LIs to tomato, but it didn't work. The reason why is because these aren't just plain text. These are actually all anchor elements here. And anchors are a little finicky when it comes to text color. You need to actually select the anchors themselves to change their color. And I'm going to use text decoration none to get rid of that underline. So now, there we go. That's more like what we're going for. And just to review, I could be more specific and select my anchors this way. All anchors inside of list items, inside of the element with the class of navigation. That works. Add 2 CSS properties to those divs with the class of box. Float left and width of 33.3%. I'm going to not do float left. I'm going to do width 30%, display inline block. And then I'm going to grab the images inside of .box and give them a max width of 100%. So now they will not be wider than 100% of the width of their container. They'll fit inside their divs. There we go. Okay, not bad. We're getting there. Let's apply text align center to my body and get everything nice and centered. Not bad. It's coming along. Now notice I applied text align center to my body, which inherits to everything. Everything inherits that text align center. These divs, the paragraphs inside these divs, the H2s inside these divs, the divs themselves, this H1. The only thing that didn't inherit it are my list items, and that is because I gave them the property text align right using a more specific CSS selector. And it's further down. Okay. Select the image, blah, blah, blah. All right, here's a good thing to focus on. If you want your images to all be the same height, well, I'm going to select my images, and I'm going to give them all a height of 150 pixels. And what that does is it squashed the earth, and it stretched dragon bones, and it stretched the octopus a little bit, I think. So now some of the aspect ratios are a little bit off. And the more extreme we make this height, the more we're going to see that skewing. A good way to get rid of this effect or control this effect is using a property that you may run into called object fit. So if I do object fit cover, it's going to make sure the images retain their original aspect ratio. They're not going to squash, they're not going to stretch. They're going to fit inside the space allotted to them. Now, but let's say I wanted dragon bones to be clear and completely visible no matter what. Well, then I could do object position, and I think it's 0%, 0%, 100%. Yep. Now that kind of negatively affects the earth and the octopus, but you get the point. Now, dragon bones is always going to be visible because we're telling the browser that we want the images to always be focused on the leftmost side and the bottommost side. So the bottom left corner, essentially. This object fit cover, object position, 0, 100%, these are commonly used properties and values that you'll see often when using background images too. You'll see background size, background position, background repeat. These are all different properties when using background images, and the principles are the same for background images and object fit or object position. Okay, let me comment that one out because I like the octopus. And I think that brings us to the end of week 2. Select the P elements. Not going to do that. Let's jump to week 3. Any questions so far? You're all pretty silent. All right, fantastic. Week 3. What CSS would you write to center a div? Margin 0 auto. Remember, that's only going to work if the div has an actual width. Otherwise, it's going to be automatically 100% the width of your window. What is the CSS selector for a div with a class of box? It's going to be div.box. That is specifically selecting the div or any div with the class of box. Any div with the class of box. What is the CSS selector for the class container? Dot container. This is going to select any element, image div, body, h2, doesn't matter, any element with the class of container. Write the HTML for a div with an h1 inside it. I'll skip it. How do you write out a link tag to connect your HTML to your CSS? Well, one more time, that's going to be link rel equals Stylesheet href equals css/main.css. Again, if your styles are not applying, if you think your styles are not working in some way, if you open up your inspector, select an element, and you don't see any of your custom styles here in your styles tab, in the styles tab of your inspector, 90% of the time it will be because there's an issue with your link tag, the file path, or maybe I see a lot of students misspell Stylesheet. They'll leave out the E. That will break it. It won't work. Or if you're using source instead of href, that will break it. It won't work. So make sure your link tag is correct. Okay. What does PSD stand for? PSD stands for Photoshop Document. As far as you guys are concerned, all you need to know is it's an image. It's an image file, a static image that you may be given on the job and asked to turn into a functional website. Now, often they will be images, pictures. Other times they will be actual paper prototypes or even wireframes, which are more complicated prototypes. They might even be interactive prototypes made with something called InVision. This is all stuff you might want to think about familiarizing yourself with as you get closer to graduation. Only the terminology, if nothing else, because you need to sound like you know what you're talking about. But for our purposes right now, a PSD is a static image that we need to turn into a functional site. What are 3 uses of GitHub? GitHub is great for version control. It's great for sharing and keeping your code open source. It's great for collaborating with other developers or other development teams. Version control and collaboration are the primary advantages of GitHub. What is the DOM? The DOM is the Document Object Model. And essentially what the DOM is the rendered version of your code, the live version of your code. It is the live environment that is created by the browser based on the HTML and CSS and later JavaScript, which you feed it. This code that we're writing is essentially the blueprints, and then the browser takes those blueprints and creates a live environment called the DOM that exists independent of the code which you wrote. It interprets that code, throws it away, and creates the DOM. Later, with JavaScript, you'll learn how to manipulate the DOM after the fact. Currently, the only way to do it is, well, don't worry about it. The point is the DOM is, what you're seeing when you load a website is not your code per se, but really the product of your code, which is the DOM. If that's confusing, that's completely okay. I'm happy to talk about it more, but we're running low on time, and I would like to keep moving. What does the Overflow CSS rule do? Overflow allows you to decide how to handle content which overflows a container. So real fast, if I create a div with an image inside of it, and let's just do any image. I'm going to save. I'm going to refresh. We've got a gigantic image that very much overflows the div which we created. Okay, but what we can do is select that div, and we can give it the overflow property of hidden. And now we can't scroll to the left or right anymore. I don't know if you can tell, but I cannot scroll right anymore. I can still scroll up and down, but all the content to the right of what we can see here in the window is actually overflowing the div, and because we've given the div the property of overflow hidden, it's now completely hidden. We can't see it anymore. Another option is overflow scroll, which will pretty much put us back where we were. You can scroll now, but what's happening is the div itself has like its own internal scroll bar, which is kind of weird. It's useful for text, however. It's very useful for text, or if you have an embedded article on your page or something like that. It's going crazy right now, sorry. Very useful for that. I use overflow hidden a lot to kind of control how images or content behaves on a given site. Overflow visible is obviously the initial default value. All right, let me show you real fast what scroll looks like with text. Okay, let me give this div a background color so we can see where it ends, and a height of 100 pixels. A width of also 100 pixels. Okay, right now overflow is set to hidden. If I set it to initial, we're going to see the text just kind of overflow down the page awfully. If I change this to scroll, we can actually scroll within the div. Okay, so that can be useful. There can be some fun applications there. What does the z-index CSS rule do? The z-index essentially determines the vertical stacking order of an element. I'm not going to get too into it, but if you have elements overlapping and you find that the element you want to be on top is actually underneath, you probably need to give it a z-index. And you can give something a z-index of 0, a negative z-index if you want to be sure it's behind. You can give something a z-index of 999 if you want to make sure it's always on top. But I will say that z-indexes only work on elements which are not positioned static. So an element needs to have position relative, absolute, or fixed for z-index to do anything. If you don't actually want to move an element, but you want it to make sure it's always on top, just give it position relative. Remember, position relative doesn't move an element on its own, and it doesn't affect any other positioning. And then you can give it a z-index of anything you want. What is the CSS selector that references an h1 element with the class of 1? That's going to be h1.1. Okay? What is the difference between responsive and adaptive design? Well, adaptive design is pretty much what a lot of companies used to have. I don't know if you remember ever having to go to the mobile version of a site. Rather than going to google.com on your phone, you'd have to go to m.google.com or something like that. And what that meant is companies had different websites depending on the device that they were using, that a user would be using. If you were on a phone, you'd have to go to the mobile site. If you were on a desktop, you'd have to go to the desktop site. That's adaptive design, and it's really not used anymore because it divides your traffic. It's not good for search engine optimization. It really just makes for a very unfriendly user experience. What we have nowadays is responsive design. And a good example of responsive design, believe it or not, is the Windows homepage. So an example of responsive design is, you see these 4 sections in the what can we help you find area here? Well, when I change the width of my window, not only are they resizing, they're getting smaller rather than overflowing, but eventually they completely change their layout. They go from 2 rows of 2 rather than 1 row of 4. And if I get really small, like mobile screen size, well, that's when they stack. They become much more vertically oriented. The way the information is laid out completely changes to better adapt to the device that a user may be using. So even if you're on a mobile device and you load this desktop web page, it will appear in a very mobile-friendly fashion. Same with, a tablet in landscape, or a tablet in portrait mode, or a high-resolution screen. It will change the way the information is laid out. It will hide some information, show other information, depending on the device you're using. That is responsive design. And media queries are used for responsive design. Media queries basically serve as an on-off switch for chunks of code. So you might have a large chunk of CSS that you only want to apply when a user is on a mobile device. And the way you would handle that is with a media query. A media query that makes sure that the code inside of it, the CSS inside of it, only turns on, only activates when the screen is under a certain size. So only when you're on a small screen will this CSS activate. Only when you're on a large screen will this CSS activate. That's how media queries work. And the way media queries look, it's going to be something like @media, and then in parentheses, max width or min width, something like 500 pixels. Opening, closing curly braces. And inside these curly braces, just write regular old CSS. Nothing special. And you can write CSS as exactly as you might anywhere else. Anything like that. Okay, so this is how a media query might look. You will see them with both max width and min width, but we'll get a little bit more into that when we hit week 4. The meta viewport tag basically makes your media queries work the way you'd expect. The meta viewport tag, and let's just pull it from W3 Schools, sets the scale that your browser uses to determine when the media queries activate. Okay? It basically levels the playing ground for all browsers, for all devices. It makes sure that we're using the correct dimension, or the correct thing against which to determine when our media queries turn on and when they turn off. Otherwise, you might find certain media queries don't work at all, or they behave unexpectedly. So if you want to find the meta viewport tag, simply look it up. You can pull it straight from W3 Schools, just like I did. You don't need to memorize it or anything, but it is important to know what it does. And it is important to know that if your media queries aren't working correctly or the way you'd expect, the first thing you should do is make sure your meta viewport tag is present and correct. Exercises. Oh, thank you, God, they are small. Create a copy of your template folder. Here we go. In HTML, create a nav bar with 5 functional links. Now it tells me to create a nav bar. It's entirely up to me now if I want to do this with a nav element, or just jump straight into a UL element, or a div, any kind of element I want. I have the freedom to do this however I'd like now. The ways we've learned are with a UL, with a class of nav, or a nav with a class of navigation. I'm just going to do it with UL. I'll give it a class of navigation, not to be confusing. Close it, and create 5 functional links. Remember, Create 5 functional links does not mean create 5 functional link tags. It means create 5 functional anchor tags. Once again, I'm going to have them all go to Google, because in the end, doesn't everything ultimately go to Google? Close the anchor, close the LI. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Link 1, link 2, link 3, link 4, and link 5. Reload the page. Okay. Now I need to style these. Navigation, LI, that's selecting my list items inside of the element with the class of navigation. Display, inline block. Okay. Margin, 15 pixels. Let's select my UL with the class of navigation and give it the property of text align center, background color, tomato. Okay. Now I'm going to select the anchors inside the list items inside the element with the class of navigation. I'm going to make them white. If you don't know, this is an easy hashtag to remember. An easy hex code to remember, and it's the hex code for white. You'll probably see it a lot, even if you don't use it a lot. It's a good thing to be able to recognize. Text decoration none. That should get rid of the underline. Okay. Now, add a hover effect to the links. I love this stuff. I really do. I love hover effects. To add a hover effect to something, I'm going to start by adding a hover effect to the LIs themselves. So I'm going to select the same thing, and then at the end I'm going to add :hover. Okay, so when I hover on the LIs inside the element with the class of navigation, I want this to happen. And let's do background color violet. See what that does. Okay, so now when I hover over my list items, the background color of those list items turns violet. Let's give my list items a padding of 15 pixels, just so it's more apparent. There we go. Something like that. So that's a very quick and easy hover effect. It doesn't look so great though. So let's see, what else can we do? Well, what we can do is we can select the list items without the hover effect and give them what's called a transition property. I'm going to go for 0.5 seconds ease. The transition property is not something you really need to know, but it can make your hover effects look so much more professional and more appealing. And it's a really easy thing to add. So all I did was add this transition property to the list item elements, not with the hover effect. The plain old list item elements. And now, when I activate that hover effect, you might not be able to see it in the live stream, but the background color is actually fading in nice and gently. And it just feels a lot more professional. It feels cleaner. It feels smoother. I'm going to copy that transition effect, give it to the anchors, and now I'm going to also do, when I hover on the list items, I want the anchors to change as well. They're going to change to, man, I have no idea, purple. And font size, let's go 18 pixels. It's probably huge. Oh no, not bad. Let's go 25 pixels. So now, not only does the background change, but the font size of the links themselves gets bigger. So the links actually look like they're growing and getting highlighted. And actually the purple's not bad. And now, because of that transition effect, going from one to the other, it gives it this cool jelly-like effect. I would say try it on your own if it's not coming through on the stream, but it's a really nice way to add some engaging little transition and hover effects to your page with very little effort. All I did was add this transition property to the base element, and then we use the hover effect to say when we hover over this element, we want this CSS to take effect. Okay? Create 3 button elements and make them flat buttons. Okay, so below my UL, I'm going to create button type equals button. Click me. Copy this. So these are the default buttons. And when we say make them a flat button, we want to make them look essentially like these buttons. They're very, very modern, very clean looking. Flat design is very, 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 very big in web design and front-end development nowadays, so it's a good thing to get to familiarize yourself with. Personally, I'm actually not the greatest fan of flat design, but I often have to use it. In this case, however, it is very effective. I do think flat buttons are much more effective than these Windows 95 looking buttons. And to make these buttons flat, we want to select them. And first we want to get rid of that dark border around them. So I'm going to do border none. And then we want to change that background from that weird white gray steely gradient. I'm going to do background color. Let's just do lime. Let's not do lime. Let's do green. And we'll change the color of the font to white. And let's give it a little more padding. Let's go for 15 pixels of padding on the top and bottom and 25 pixels of padding on the left and right. Here we go. Got 3 nice looking buttons. Let's also give them a box shadow of, what is it, 0, 10 pixels, 0, something like that. Way too big. So now they've got a nice little shadow. I would pick a different color than that, well, than all of this, obviously, but nice shadow. And let's see if we can add a cool hover effect to this. Button hover. Let's do box shadow, none. Background color, line. And let's add that transition effect to our base element. So I reload. There we go. The button lights up when I hover over it, and that box shadow disappears. If you wanted to get really fancy here, you know what? I'm not going to do it. It's not worth it. We should keep moving. But you can actually make it so the button looks like it's depressing while that box shadow disappears, so it looks like you're pushing down on the button as you hover over it. A lot of fun things you can do with hover effects, and I would encourage you all to experiment with them. They go a long way for very little effort. That's week 3. Let's jump into week 4. All right, what do media queries do? We discussed that already, and we will discuss it quite a bit more as we work through these exercises. What does max width and min width do? Now, you guys have seen me use max width several times on images as a CSS property. And it's absolutely true that max width or min width, or there's max height and min height as well, are completely valid as CSS properties on an element. That said, what these questions are referring to is what do they do in this context? What do they do in the context of a media query? And what they do is essentially define the screen size at which the code inside those media queries will take effect. So very simply, let's say h1 color red, and inside here h1 color blue. Let's do max width 500 pixels and min width 1000 pixels. Get rid of this. And by default, H1s are black, but let's just write it up here just to remind us. And let's add an H1 to our site. Reload, we've got our H1. Open my inspector so I can see how many pixels we're at. Okay, we're at a width of Sorry guys, hold on 1 second. Looks like my media queries are not working. Oh, no, I'm just zoomed in. There we go. Yeah, sorry. So it's because I'm zoomed in really far. So I'm going to zoom out for this. You should still be able to see what color my hello world is. So let's bring it around here. Okay, my window is at 850 pixels wide-ish. 850 pixels wide. Okay. If I bring my window below 500 pixels, hello world turns red. If I bring it above 1000 pixels, hello world turns blue. So you see, we can actually write media queries to anticipate what we want our site to look like at different device screen sizes. So max width in this case says up to a maximum screen width of 500 pixels, I want all H1s to be red colored. And min width says from a minimum screen width of 1000 pixels and up, I want H1s to be blue colored. And they are doing exactly that. You can get much more sophisticated with your media queries, obviously. You can change the layout of your site. You can change the order in which information is presented. You can hide certain elements. It's very important. But that's the difference between max width and min width. Another important thing to know is that min width and max width apply to websites that are developed either mobile first or desktop first. If you see sites with a lot of max width media queries, that usually means they were developed desktop first. So they were developed on a desktop or laptop, and then they were shifted down in size at increments, and additional media queries were written to control how they look at smaller screen sizes. Min width, on the other hand, generally means they were designed mobile first. They were designed for a mobile audience, a primarily mobile audience or user base, and then media queries were added for larger screen sizes. And a good example of that would be something like Uber. Nobody gives a crap what the Uber desktop website looks like. They care what the mobile version of the site looks like, or what the mobile version of the UI looks like. That's obviously more important for a company like Uber. So their digital face persona presentation is always developed mobile first. And more companies are developing mobile first as mobile becomes the #1 standard of how users engage with companies nowadays. Okay, what does the meta viewport tag do? We discussed. Why is responsive design important? We have discussed. It is very important. Very, very important. How do you view Chrome's mobile developer tools? Well, real fast, you open your inspector, and next to the little button we click to highlight elements is another button that says Toggle Device Toolbar. If you click on that, you will see your web page at different device screen sizes, and you can test. So here's an iPhone 6 Plus, here's a Galaxy S5, here's what it's going to look like on a Galaxy S5, in other words, an iPad, etc., etc. And you can set your own custom sizes as well. Like here's a tablet, it's 787 pixels, etc. The mobile developer tools are really useful, but nothing is more useful than simply dragging your screen in. Okay, I would recommend this method over the mobile developer toolbar in general, but it's still very useful to see how your site might render differently on different device sizes. What is the difference between min and max width in a media query? We discussed. What does display none do? Display none hides elements. Let's say H1, we give it display none at a max width of 500 pixels. What that's going to do is cause our H1 to disappear once we hit a small enough screen size. The reason why that's useful is there are a lot of elements which you don't want to load on the mobile version of your site, either because they're too big, they're not important enough, or they're going to slow down the loading of your site. For example, you would never want an auto-playing video on a mobile site. Kind of the way you might see a video autoplay in the background of a big header on a web page. You would never want to see that, and the reason why you would never want to see that is because it would severely slow down load time on a mobile phone. You might also have a lot of extra information that is perfectly fine to have on a desktop layout, but on a mobile layout you want to get more quickly to the point. You have a smaller screen size to deal with. Most users aren't going to scroll all the way down to the bottom, so you want the most important information for your users to be extremely visible and extremely apparent. So you probably want to design to keep that in mind. You might want to hide superfluous elements, or you might want to collapse them, maybe in a collapsible menu or something along those lines. And display none is a good way to do that. The opposite of display none is not going to be display visible or anything like that. It's actually going to be something like display block or display inline or display inline block. If you want to reset an element's display property from none to not none, and you're not sure whether you want to default to block or inline block or something else entirely, remember, use initial. Display initial. It's a very useful reset button for a CSS property. Okay. I'm not going to get into animate.css right now. That's something I'll talk about on another actual magic hours. But what is the maximum amount of media queries you should use per website? Probably 3, maybe 4. You don't want to go crazy with your media queries. You don't want to design for the one jerk out there who's going to view your page like this. You just don't. It's not worth it. It's not worth the brain power. It's not worth the time. There's always going to be someone who insists on having your site open like this, and you don't want to design for that. It is not worth your time. So you want to hit the major ones. You definitely want to have a media query for mobile, a media query for tablet, maybe a media query for a super big desktop screen, something like that. Maybe a couple more if you have a handful of elements that require some more precise styling. But in general, do not go crazy with your media queries. It is not worth it. I'm going to devote another session to talking about Bootstrap, so I'm going to skip over those for now and jump straight into the exercises. They are also short, so let's do it. Create 4 div elements, each with a class of box and a second class. The second class can be any color you want. We will set the background color of each div to the color of the second class. So div class equals box space tomato. Let me go ahead and copy this and rename these to lime. I wonder if eggplant is a color the browser recognizes. Eggplant and blue. No, teal. Teal. Okay. Now I'm going to select each of these divs by that second class and set the background color. So dot tomato, background color, tomato. Dot lime, background color, lime. Dot eggplant, background color, moment of truth, eggplant, god damn it, purple. Dot teal, background color, teal. Alright, select the body element and add text align center as a property and value. Body, text align, center. Remember, text align is the property, center is the value. Select the class of box and add 3 properties: display, height, and width. Let's do display inline block, height 150 pixels, width 50%. Okay, let's reload. There we go, we've got our 4 divs. 4 divs, each a different color. One, unfortunately, purple. What's next? Using media queries, make it so the second and third div elements disappear when you shrink the screen size below 600 pixels. So for that, we're going to want a max width media query, max width 600 pixels, and it's the second and third, so that's lime and eggplant. Dot lime, comma, dot eggplant. That comma is selecting 2 selectors, okay? So that's 1 eggplant selector, 1 lime selector. That's how you can actually select multiple selectors at one time in CSS with a comma. Not with a space, like assigning different class names, but with a comma. And I'm going to go display. Actually, no, let's do opacity, just to make this a little more interesting. Opacity 0. And I'm going to give all my dot box elements a transition property of 0.5 seconds. Okay. Now let's reload. The traditional way to do this would be to use display none, and that will work perfectly fine. But just for fanciness' sake, I'm going to go with opacity 0. We'll compare the two in a second. And now when I shrink my screen size, they fade out. And then as I expand, they fade back in. Fade out, fade in, fade out, fade in. Okay, so that's using opacity 0. If I switch back to display none, watch what happens. They disappear entirely. And that teal div down here shifts up into the lime div's spot, because it's like they never existed. So this is display none. And this is opacity 0. Opacity just determines how opaque or transparent something is. It goes on a scale from 0 to 1, 1 being fully opaque, 0 being fully transparent. Okay. Using media queries, make it so that all the divs have their width extended to 100% of the screen when you increase the screen size beyond 1000 pixels. So this is going to require a min width media query, 1000 pixels. And I'm going to select all .box elements and give them a width of 100%. Reload. Okay, so that's 826 pixels all the way to 1000. Let's jump this up to 1500. There we go. The reason why we're actually seeing that warp is because of the transition property. Okay, if I turn this off, it's going to happen instantaneous. Pop. It's going to pop in and out. All right, so that's media queries in a nutshell. And that's all the material I really want to go over this week. What I would like to do real fast is just show you guys a couple of exercises and demonstrations and things I have on my code pen in case they're helpful to any of you. So, I'm not going to jump into Bootstrap. I did mention I was going to go over Orange Juice, didn't I? Sorry, we were kind of out of time, but I would like to demonstrate coding through Orange Juice anyway later this week, so I'll probably make a video of that and simply post it. And if anyone has questions in the meantime, please feel free to ask. If you go to my code pen, Evan Winston or @irrelevant Evan, you can find a lot of my demonstrations and exercises. I have a couple on explaining relative and absolute positioning. I have a couple for Bootstrap that I would encourage you to look into if you're into Bootstrap right now. Here's one that demonstrates the difference between text-align center and margin 0 auto, which is a good one to practice with. Margin 0 auto has been applied to this div, and it centers the div. Text-align center has been applied to this one, and it centers the content inside this div. The content inside this div is not centered. So that's one good example. Here's a media queries example. So as I change the size of my screen, the percentage of space the image takes up is actually going to change, as is the font size of the text beneath it, until finally they actually center and the image takes up 100% of the width, and then eventually the image is going to disappear. And we have nothing but a button which we can use to toggle the image on and off. So this is a good example of media queries if you want to come in here and reverse engineer it or anything like that, or fork it. I've got another one around here somewhere, but most importantly, there's this CSS Selector Interpreter. Okay, if you want to try this out, this is something, it's not fully comprehensive, but it's a good way for breaking down CSS selectors you're not familiar with. So if I write div button in here and select interpret, it will tell me any button element which is inside of any div element which is inside of any div element. If I do hashtag elephant, the element with the ID of elephant. If I do div.container, any div element with the class of container, etc., etc., etc. So if we find like a really complicated one, I don't know, none of these are terribly complicated, but let's see, what does this selector look like? Oh, that's not bad. Yeah, that is pretty complicated. But we interpret it. What we get is the full interpretation of that CSS selector with the appropriate language you should use to think about how to break it down. Okay, now this is way more complex of one than you need to worry about. But if you run into a selector you don't recognize or that you're just not sure what it's grabbing, take advantage of this. Use it. Try it out. All right, that's pretty much it for today. I hope this was helpful to at least a couple of you. But feel free to reach out to me if you have any other questions. Next week I'd like to do the following couple of weeks through Bootstrap and jQuery, and then after that start working through the beginning of JavaScript. I'd like to make it a regular thing to review big chunks of the material every couple weeks. So if you're a fan, if you like it, let me know, let the other mentors know, so we can keep prioritizing it and making this a thing. Otherwise, everybody have a good night. Hope you all had a good Thanksgiving holiday, and I'll see you soon.